Hello and welcome to this week's episode on the Kescast YouTube channel. My name is Neve, I'm in Year 12 and I'm one of the English academic prefects. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about The Great Gatsby and how we can place that into its contextual setting, and perhaps make a few links to the book itself through quotations and how Fitzgerald explores the context of the period and of the time through his novel The Great Gatsby. So although this may seem more of a podcast targeted towards sixth form students, it does help give an insight to lower school students as to what the A-level course is based upon, has its foundations within. So contextual studies is a main aspect of writing an A-level essay. So that's what I'm going to explore with you today, and I hope that this is useful for any Year 13s or Year 12s revising going forward with Paper 2 American Literature. So to start with Fitzgerald himself. So Fitzgerald was born in 1896 to a middle-class family. His father, Edward, was a businessman, and Molly, his mother, was an immigrant from a prosperous family, meaning his mother was of a higher class and of higher wealth than her father. Fitzgerald's interest in society comes from his interaction with rich children on the street that he grew up on, called Summit Avenue. Where he grew up, there was many prosperous families, and he perched on the hierarchy of society. Edward, his father, lost his job, meaning the family moved to New York in 1897, showing Fitzgerald's the New York's strong impact and sort of resonating effect on Fitzgerald in his work. And this eventually left the family to fend off his mother's fortune. So in terms of his college days, Fitzgerald went to a prep school and then to Princeton University, where he wrote scripts and other literature for the Princeton publications. It was there he met Fay, and Fay, hence the name Daisy Fay, one of the key characters within The Great Gatsby. Fay was a mentor to Fitzgerald, who inspired him to write his first work, and his first piece of work was The Mystery of Raymond Mortgage, which was his first published piece of work, and I believe that was in the early 1900s. However, Fitzgerald then was enlisted and joined the army in 1917, where he was assigned to Camp Montgomery. And this is where in 1918 he met Zelda Sayre, who was the daughter of Alabama's Supreme Court judge and also of a higher wealth status. So it's really important and significant here that Fitzgerald throughout his life was surrounded by this hierarchy, social status that he could not reach. And we can clearly see this impact of Fitzgerald's personal life within The Great Gatsby. Notably, there has been strong connections made between Fitzgerald and the character or protagonist Gatsby himself, through his relationship with Daisy Fay, or here Zelda Sayre. So it's believed that Fitzgerald chose Gatsby to represent himself and trying to get the girl, in quotation marks, so trying to achieve the love of a woman who was of a higher status. And this can also be seen, interestingly, through the narrator, Nick. In chapter 1, Nick says it's a libel unto poor when he explains the reason why he doesn't get married to a girl out west. But perhaps more significantly, it's Daisy's ambitions and conditions that she needs in order to get married, the force of love, financial security, and of unquestionable practicality that she desires in order to marry Gatsby. But in the end, she marries Tom Buchanan. So throughout the rest of his life, Scott and Zelda became a symbolic couple of the Jazz Age, which is a term coined by Fitzgerald himself in the Tales of the Jazz Age. And they both travelled across Europe until in 1921 they had their first daughter, Scotty, and in 1930 Zelda had her first mental breakdown, which eventually resulted in hospitalisation for schizophrenia. And this actually placed Fitzgerald in a severe amount of debt. Not only was his work becoming less successful, but the bills that he had to pay for Zelda were becoming increasingly burdening, I suppose. So the other works written by Fitzgerald that you may have heard of, This Side of Paradise was his success in 1920, which focuses on his experiences at Princeton University. The Beautiful and the Damned was published in 1922, The Great Gatsby in 1925, which was originally limited in success, and Tender is the Night in 1934. So now we move on to the Jazz Age itself. So the Jazz Age, like I mentioned before, was a phrase coined by Fitzgerald as the face of the decade, representing this fast-moving age and pace of the 1920s. It was named as such due to a popular music genre of the period, reflecting the spirit of rebelliousness and pleasure-seeking of many youths in the 1920s. In part, the Jazz Age was a reaction to World War I and the deprivation it saw to the Allied countries. However, America remained this prosperous industrial hub of ammunition, of cars, of other manufacturing. It was always this prosperous key location where the American dream was destined to flourish for all of these dream seekers. And Gatsby addresses the issues behind the decade's rebelliousness and pleasure-seeking. So with Georgians, It Takes Two to Make an Accident, and focusing on the significance of alcohol within the book is very important, not only because of the Prohibition through the 19th Amendment, which I'll talk about in a minute, but also because it shows the sheer blindness of many of the upper class, how their carelessness, as put in Chapter 9, how Tom and Daisy retreated back into their carelessness. They were careless people. It shows that this conspicuous consumption and this blindness of the upper class, in fact, does have consequences, but because of this carelessness, they are blind to it. So quotations showing this Jazz Age within the novel would be music from my neighbour's house, men and girls came and went like moths, and yellow cocktail music. Colour symbolism is frequent throughout the Great Gatsby. However, the colour yellow, associating with youth, fertility, prosperity, wealth, money, gold. Gatsby's golden suits and golden silk shirts, his yellow car, the yellow cocktail music, the yellow cocktail dresses. So moving on to the Prohibition. So the Prohibition was essentially a ban on making and selling alcohol in the US between 1920 and 1933. During this period, a great deal of alcohol was consumed nonetheless and led to the creation of speakeasies for the illegal distribution and sale of alcohol. And this supplying of illegal alcohol became known as bootlegging, which Gatsby is supposed to have performed. And this was formed as part of an amendment by the government which made alcohol cheaper. Existing supplies could also be consumed by households. So, like I just mentioned, the significance of alcohol within the Great Gatsby is overwhelming. So, Tom brought out a bottle of whiskey from the locked bureau door, 42nd Street cellar with the speakeasy in Chapter 4. You can buy anything in drugstores these days, with Tom's snide comment to Gatsby. And this, in turn, links to crime within the period. So, crime, there was a growing black market and organised crime during the period with a rise in numerous gangs and gang wars. We normally associate this crime with bootlegging, with figures such as Al Capone. And speakeasies were the main source of bootlegged alcohol, with over 100,000 speakeasies in New York alone, it's presumed. Speakeasies were password protected, sort of underground bars or pubs that provided a hub of entertainment, shown in Chapter 4 as more of a gentleman's sort of club, with Wolfsheim, Gatsby, Nick and Tom also being spotted there. And they provided entertainment such as jazz music and performances by the new form of women called flapper girls, showing their scandalous behaviour of the 20s. So crime linking in with alcohol has a big significance within Gatsby. So when Gatsby's first introduced through the presumptions of different characters, he's described as having killed a man or being the cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm. And Wolfsheim is believed to have fixed the World Series and made Gatsby, knew he could use him good. Because of his gentleman appearance, it was easy to perform corruption and deceit in the society. Gatsby in turn mentions to Nick how he has a little business on the side, a sort of confidential thing that he can get Nick involved in if he so wishes. So now moving on to the more positive side of the 1920s that we tend to see in films and just generally associate to, and that is entertainment, the jazz music, the looser morals, the flapper girls, the fashion, the dresses. And this can be first seen through radio's introduction. So radio introduced the first Hollywood stars and actors. In 1927, we saw the first film produced with sound, with a jazz background music soundtrack. And before then, black and white films were the most prominent. And jazz music became prominent within clubs and speakeasies. And this in turn is an amalgamation of blues, swing, and African-American music all mixed into one. And it moved east due to migration, and numerous figures emerged as a result, such as Louis Armstrong. And we can also see within this the impact of automobiles and technology, so how this had an impact on how society functioned and also events that occur within Gatsby. So there are massive leaps forward in technology inventions within this period. So the telephone and the automobile were both fairly recent inventions which were modifying social behaviour and had a massive impact on communication and travel. However, within Gatsby, this effect is not always positive. For example, with the car in Gatsby's first party scene, 50 feet from the door, a dozen headlights illuminated a bizarre and tumultuous scene, but violently shorn of one wheel retinue coupe. We also see in the book by D.H. Lawrence, The Studies in Classic American Literature, it's argued Americans who are prolific inventors because they are idealists and they prefer to let a machine to do the doing. The terminus aviation flight made air travel popular, and the trend method of transportation became much more efficient. Adverts in turn persuaded customers to purchase new models of cars, and in 1913 industrial production lines became more efficient and also more dangerous. Henry Ford was the main manufacturer of cars, with half of those being sold being Fords. So now moving on into the changing role in women. So there are numerous women characters and women within The Great Gatsby. We tend to think of Daisy Buchanan or Daisy Fay. We tend to think of Jordan Baker or Myrtle Wilson. But the pure figure of a flapper girl is this independent, scandalous, a bit more loose in her morals, a bit revealing in her sexual desire. And we see this after World War I. And the new type of woman seems to emerge at the same time as the 20th Amendment. And the 20th Amendment in the US gave women the right to vote. In 1920, that was. So this in turn brought looser morals and sexual freedom for women, and in turn altered fashion. So women wore dresses without corsets for the first time, instead leaving slip dresses, which didn't enhance the figure and gave a more boyish appearance. We have shorter hairstyles with waved styles which were no longer pinned up. Makeup was worn more liberally, with face definition being amplified, and smoking also became common alongside hosiery, often being on show, notifying society of a woman's new sexual freedom. And as a result of this, interestingly, the cosmetic and cigarette industry grew rapidly as a result. So we might draw sort of alignments with Jordan. She's described in chapter 1 as slender, small-breasted woman with an erect carriage. and how Jordan's going to play in the tournament tomorrow. Women had a much more liberal place in sport, such as Jordan with golf. And then through Myrtle with her sexual vitality, with her sitting on Tom's lap, how she licked her lips. And Catherine, her sister, also, her eyebrows have been plucked and then drawn on again at a rakish angle, her hair bobbed in strange new ways. So alongside this development in industry, we also see an increase in radio and broadcasting, because radio is a very recent invention during this period. So radio is first introduced in the early 1900s with a human voice presenter. Radio enabled sports such as baseball and boxing to be heard nationally in America, integrating society more, whereas previously sporting events were separated into class systems, so this dates back as early as Tudor medieval periods. Same with the theatre. To watch a sport or spectate a sport, it was separated and divided into different social classes, for example, or seen as more commoner sort of thing to do, such as football, etc. So jazz music could also be heard through the radio, and advertising made its way more commonly into the public eye. So advertising itself found its root in the industrial expansion of the 1880s. The mass production and lowering of prices on consumer goods meant that more items were available to more people than ever before. The construction of railroads in America provided a national market for a company's goods, and advertising therefore changed a product from simply announcing the existence of the product in a dull, dry fashion to persuading the public that they needed and deserved their own product. Prior to the First World War, journals were used and were put into circulation, exposing corruption and greed in business and politics. However, changes in print technology in the 1890s and heavy dependence upon advertisers allowed publishers to drop their prices from 35 cents to a nickel, making their magazines more profitable and also widespread. And the number of readers went from around 10,000 to 500,000 by 1890. However, by the break of the First World War, readers grew weary and were bored with the magazine's campaign for reform. But after the war, general circulation of magazines picked up again, and picked up on consumerism this time. And in many of these advertisements, art and different forms of persuasion were used. So the use of celebrities in advertising was introduced, such as smoking with baseball characters, which we think today is totally absurd considering the impacts of smoking, etc. However, any bid for persuasion of the population was used. Art by the likes of Norman Rockwell was used. And it's also at this time we see the notable Coca-Cola advert come out, which is still in use and in existence today, and was one of the first companies to use this new method of persuasion for advertising and industry. So moving on to some of the final topics. So migration within America during this period. We have the Great Migration, which prompts 1.6 million minorities to migrate to areas of prosperity, such as the East Coast and New York, to pursue the American dream. The Great Migration was a relocation of more than 6 million African Americans from the rural South to the cities of the North. This in turn may have led to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK, which had been officially founded in the 1800s, however had been dissolved in 1869. However, the KKK had continued underground, and when World War I broke out in 1914, industrialized areas began to show signs of supporting the KKK's ideas once more. So, in the decade between 1910 and 1920, the black population of major northern cities grew by large percentages. New York increased by 66%, Chicago 148%, Philadelphia 500%, and Detroit 611%. Many new arrivals found jobs in factories, slaughterhouses, and foundries, where working conditions were arduous and sometimes dangerous. Female migrants had a harder time finding work, spurring heated competition for domestic labour positions. And often these work placements were actually based on racial discrimination. For example, a lot of African Americans found jobs in the fishing business instead of perhaps working in a factory, which may have had higher wages. However, this particular African American culture coming to New York led to the rise of the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance was as it is described in the 1920s, a new Negro movement, which today is discriminatory language. However, it had a huge impact on culture, such as music, arts, literature, and jazz music, tying in all aspects of society into these speakeasies. So now we move on to the American dream itself and American ideals. So the American dream is the national ethos of the United States as defined by Wikipedia. It's a set of ideals, democracy, rights, liberty, opportunity, and equality, in which freedom includes the opportunity for prosperity and success, as well as an upward mobility for the family and children, achieved through hard work in a society with few barriers. In the definition of the American dream by James Truslow Adams in 1931, life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each according to ability or achievement, regardless of social class or circumstances of birth. The American dream itself is rooted in the Declaration of Independence, which proclaims that all men are created equal, with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Also, the US Constitution promotes similar freedom in the preamble, to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our prosperity. We can see the American dream throughout Gatsby, and it is believed that Gatsby himself as the protagonist represents the American dream, coming from nothing to something, coming from poor to this new type of money. We see the consequences of the American dream with what foul dust floated in the wake of Gatsby's dreams. This new money and prosperity through the sunshine, the great bursts of leaves in West Egg. Spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivy, this concealing new money, by old money. We also see the failure of the American dream, notably through Wilson. Wilson's described as one of these ash-grey men who move dimly and already crumbling. He's anemic and he even blends in with the colour of his wool, showing how deathly and ghostly this character is. He's haunting his community. He cannot escape. He cannot reach this horizon that he wants to achieve. Instead, he's forced to nearly migrate. He says, my wife and I, we want to move west. He can only flee. He cannot gain and cannot grow. We also see the American dream through numerous different literature in the American period. So we perhaps see it through The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, My Antonia by Willie Cather, The Great Gatsby, and The Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. And since the 1920s, numerous authors such as Sinclair Lewis in 1922 with his novel Babbitt and F. Scott Fitzgerald in The Great Gatsby, places this satirical materialism in the chase for the American dream. So J. Gatsby's death mirrors the American dream's demise, reflecting the pessimism and the pessimistic nature of modern-day Americans. And we can see this when Gatsby looks across the bay in, I believe it's chapter 6, when he takes Daisy to his house. He says that the meaning of the green light had seemed to vanish forever, that this dream had now faded, that once man reaches where he believes he wants to be, the purpose and the determination and the sweat and the toil and the tears that have taken to get there seem almost non-existent, that they had no meaning in the first place, that it almost wasn't worth it. So finally, I just want to speak about the impact and legacy of World War One. So The Great Gatsby is obviously set in the 1920s, before the Great Depression and the Wall Street crash, which is more significant in The Grapes of Wrath. However, it is mentioned through the characters of Nick and Gatsby, as they were both soldiers within the war. And World War One was also known as the Great War, which was fought between July 1914 and November 1918. And America was actually drawn into this conflict in 1917, so a year before it ended. So they were almost a last resort. However, because they were so prosperous, the war increased this prosperity and accelerated America's industrial production, which resulted in the economic boom of the 1920s. And we see the war referenced in how Gatsby did extraordinarily well in the war, how Nick has this renewal of complete faith in him that he had experienced before when Gatsby mentions his role in the World War One. But perhaps also it's yet again another tool and another disguise for this corruption and carelessness. So Gatsby uses this invisible, as it is described, invisible shield of his soldier's uniform in order to steal and take Daisy. It's this idea that it's almost like, for example, in The Duchess of Malfi, when the Duchess uses religion as her riding hood, Gatsby is using this tool of chivalry, of protection, of security in order to do a corrupt deed, which is perhaps making him less secure and weak and vulnerable. So Fitzgerald plays with these contrasts throughout The Great Gatsby, contrasting appearance versus reality, for example, and this links in directly with changing attitudes, with links to Fitzgerald's life, how he moved with the fast crowd, how there was always room to perform subtle corrupt deeds as Daisy may have. And overall it builds a sense of society that is perhaps not quite as secure and prosperous as it may seem. It's completely undercut by corruption and carelessness, of failures of the American dream, of this discrimination, of this racist language shown all the time between different social classes. How the American dream, as put in The Grapes of Wrath, for example, in Grapes of Wrath, it is said that some achieve from the American dream, whereas some fail, and this is completely shown in The Great Gatsby as well. So I hope you have enjoyed this week's Kescast. I'm sorry it has been a bit of a lengthy one, but if you are using this revision, I hope it has been a really useful tool, and I hope to see you in the next Kescast this week. Thank you for listening.